Hey Fred, if you could shut the doors, that would be helpful. And good evening if you're joining with us later on as far as through the video stuff, welcome. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes. And this is part two of what we started last week. So if you are going to join with us live, last week we started with this question: isn't Christianity homophobic and transphobic? And I kind of switched things up for you all. There is another question that we were going to talk about, which is, doesn't Christianity crush diversity? And, part of this becomes the exclusive truth claims of Christianity. But the reality is, every major worldview makes exclusive claims for truth. Even relativism is making an exclusive claim for truth. So in that, it becomes the part where just because you're exclusivistic doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to crush diversity. And in fact, the argument that we would make for Christianity is that Christianity is able to hold together both unity and diversity like no other worldview. And part of what happens with Christianity is, instead of squashing cultural differences, it actually helps every culture become more of what God intended it to be. And we believe that God is a God not only of oneness, of unity, but also of diversity. So we could talk a lot more about that, but what I was really drawn to with this question about isn't Christianity homophobic and transphobic, and we could spend more time than what we're spending last week and this week, is how did we get to this place where the assumption is that if you don't go along with affirming homosexuality and transgenderism, then you must have an irrational fear and you have no good reason for having a difference from this. And so that's the approach we've taken. Again, if you're joining with us, this is a two-parter. The notes are online. And then I've handed out fresh notes. It includes the notes from last week. And I've added a few in from last week that, because as we got towards the end of last week, I was interrupted with a meeting, and when I came back, I didn't have everything that I wanted on Marxism, and I realized that in the lecture, and so I went and I added some of those things. But we're a couple minutes into this, so let me pray for us, and I'll do a quick review. And we will keep going. Lord, thank you for tonight. Again, we give praise that we can confess Jesus Christ as Lord. And what we believe, also what we've experienced, is that you are alive, your Spirit is at work within us. This is not about some sort of crawling around in the dark with no experience, but this is actually living a life of faith where you have given us numerous reasons to believe, but we also have this experience. We can't prove it with absolute certainty, but we can testify to it. You speak in our lives, you love us, you care for us, you hear our prayers, you bring your supernatural power to bear. And in all of this, we can look back to concrete realities of history. Jesus lived. Jesus made the claims of the New Testament that he is the Messiah, that he is God. He claimed that his death was the means by which the world was going to be saved. And he was raised from the dead, and it is the only good explanation for all of what is witnessed in the New Testament, and we have every reason to believe it's true. So in the midst of this world where there is doubt and fear and concerns and so many things wrong, you give us hope. And so, Lord, may we be people of hope today. And as we wrestle through these questions, and some of these questions may be questions we right here are having, may we come to a better understanding, and that understanding will fundamentally be about your goodness, your greatness, your love, and And so, Lord, bless us tonight in Jesus' name. Amen. So, quickly walking through where we were, I gave a basic outline. Where are we? How did we get there? That's what we spent most of last week talking about. And we're going to move forward, understanding the roots of the revolution, the triumph of the erotic, the triumph of the therapeutic. We'll actually be quite quick in that. The accusation and context, homophobic and transphobic. And then we'll talk a little bit about responding to those things. I shared last week that one of my big hopes with this is that we will have more empathy and more ability to listen. We will see that we are all caught up in this. This is about where we are in our culture. Our culture is trying to shape all of us. It will shape all of us in some way. Our society has shifted, we all know that what our society has gone through over the last 150 years is, the most rapid experience of the transformation of culture in world history. Agrarian society did not change all that much in a very rapid way, and we have been going through a lot. Out of this, we talked last week about this idea of expressive individualism. And this is one of the big shifts in our culture is that me, I, you, but you as the individual, you have this huge question to answer. Who am I? And the way that our culture has shaped it, the only one who can really answer it is you. And the way that you're going to answer it in some way is how you actually end up feeling about yourself. Identity is a huge part of our culture, and everything is feeding into that. And this big me has been helped along by the sense of consumerism. And with the sense of consumerism, there's all of these choices to make. Every time I make a choice in some way, I'm expressing myself. But we can feel the weight of it. We have all of these choices to make now. But that's not all of it. And so we started to break this down. We looked at some of the issues of living in a post-Christian. This was a big thing with this, of getting to expressive individualism. Instead of finding my identity basically without, that it's something kind of given, I have to determine my calling. Now there's this sense that it's within. And with this is more the sense that my sense of identity and role is not so much determined from external authority, but it's discovered, and basically I can become anybody that I feel like this is who I'm supposed to be. And the language that I gave you comes from philosopher Charles Taylor, the mimetic versus the poietic. And then started to break this down, and how did we get here? And I gave you kind of big bullet points, and then I fleshed those out. One part of how we got there is the loss of transcendence, the loss of God. We find the roots of that in David Hume. We can go before Hume. There were people who identified in some way as agnostics or atheists, through history, but very, very small groups of people. But it emerged in the Enlightenment, especially, that you're starting to have this. And David Hume was the first person who really put forward an argument against miracles that was a big part of giving a rational justification of saying, look at how the world's changed. We have the scientific revolution. Newton's unlocked the keys of understanding the physical universe. Human reason is advancing at every level. We don't need God anymore. And in fact, to believe in miracles is really to be foolish and superstitious, and any rational person would never believe in those things. And Hume formed an argument that was pretty much so persuasive that the vast majority of Western intellectuals ended up buying into it. Darwin took Hume further, because Darwin was not only just to be able to sit there and say, we don't need God to explain what's going on, but we don't need God to explain the origin of life. And Darwin really opened the door for people to really just stand with intellectual rigor and say, there's no God. Nietzsche took it all the way home and said, we've killed God. We know that God doesn't exist. Let's quit living as if he did, and therefore let's get rid of morality. When we think about our modern world and this time that we live in, and especially this idea that we're focusing on of understanding the homophobic and the transphobic, it is an outworking of the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution did not cause the sexual revolution. There were forces at work in society that did. And one of those forces is a force that says morality is oppressive. It is the present power structure using that as a means of controlling the masses. And so there is a push against morality, universal morality, and always you will find in this, in particular, a push against Christianity. So we started with the loss of God and transcendence. Then we talked about really the emergence of where we might point to say one of the things that our society really kind of focuses on a little bit, and I'm using this language intentionally, is victimhood. Our society has more of this sense of kind of identifying that we're victims, and we're being oppressed. And the beginning of this is Rousseau's idea, which is man is born free, but everywhere is in chains. And this is the beginning of the turn of society, where instead of following the Christian story, which says I'm a sinner and I'm broken, it says no, in my original state I was perfect, and the problem lies out there. And then in this very same time, the Romantics then were the next ones, and they said the place for you to really come to truth and reality is not in the external world, but it's on the inside of you. And that's where you can touch the universal. And then there was this move inward. And all of that leads to this expressive individualism, where the place that I find myself isn't looking out there, but it's looking within. And it is this sense of experience, this sense of feeling. This is where we get some of the roots of psychology, these ideas about what's going on inside of me. So we've got the loss of God. We've got the beginning of saying the real problem isn't me, but it's out there. We've got this turn inward, and where my feeling and my experience becomes the center. And then we move to this next part, the plausibility of self-creation. What's that?
I say, where are you?
I'm walking quickly through the notes, and I'm looking at the headers. Sadly, for whatever reason, the numbers did not get printed. You can see every once in a while a 1, and that's not going to help any of us. At this point, I'm review, and I will get us to a place, and I'll say, okay, here we are.
Thank you.
The plausibility of self-creation. The big idea with that is I can be whoever I want to be. I've got to, this is it. I've got to discover myself, but I can recreate myself. I can become what I feel like I'm true to. Now,
page 5, I think, is where you are.
Yeah, I'm going to be skipping through pages pretty quickly.
Okay.
But thank you for that. I might even ask you, Phil, to count, so when I get to the page, you can just tell me. Because there'll be a point where I stop and we slow down. This is a big thing as far as the expressive individualism and like when we talk about transgenderism, this idea of the plastic self, that you can really change who you are. And who you are is more about an inside thing. And the names that I give you for this are Nietzsche, Marx, and Darwin. And a big part of this becomes the idea that there are no absolute truths. There is no design. You cannot look to the exterior world for an order. Why? Because all of these people are functioning out of, there is no need for God. If you have no designer, there is no design. So, what do you have? Potentially you have chaos. People would say that Nietzsche was the father of nihilism. There is no meaning out there whatsoever. So what do you need to do? You need to create your own sense of meaning. Yeah, Doug, did you have a question?
Oh, no, sir.
Oh, okay. With Marx, I didn't talk about Marx last week in this, and so I am on page 5. I'm on the second slide, the plausibility of self-creation. For Marx, progress was not about ideas, where new ideas are countered, where new and old ideas are countered, and it should be where old ideas are countered by new ideas, and then new synthesis is born. Now, if I have anybody who's either a history major or a philosopher, what you know at that point is I'm speaking the language of Hegel. And I gave you Hegel there. Marx was responding to Hegel. And Hegel had this idea, and this is an idea that has shaped the modern West, of progress. And this is still part of a little bit of our sense of our society, this idea of progress. For him, it was all at the level of spirit, it was all at the level of the brain, it was all at the level of ideas. It wasn't the material reality. And so you have the old order, and then you have a new idea, and it's at opposite ends of the spectrums in some way. And then between that working out of the old and the new, you get a new synthesis, and the old comes in with the new, and something better is formed, and the world is just progressing this way. And there's an explanation of religion in this sort of worldview. You start out, and there's animism, and then it moves to polytheism, and then polytheism moves to monotheism, and then in monotheism you get Christianity, and here's a story of religion where an old and a new, and you're moving forward, and that's a Hegel's view of the world. Marx did it completely. He rejected the realm of ideas, and this is what he said: what really matters is material things, and humans get shaped by material realities. And so what ends up happening is progress is being done, but the real progress is when material things change. And Marx lived through the Industrial Revolution, and what he saw was how radically the Industrial Revolution changed Europe. Now, from Marx, you get this. You want to change society? It's not about ideas. Well, there is ideas. But what you do is you change the structures. You change the physical environments. You force society to change. Now, there was more to this. He was actually thinking that the way it was going to work is we'd come to a place and we were going to reach kind of the epic of humanity, and it was a socialist idea, and the workers would rise up, and they would get so frustrated with the Industrial Revolution, then everything would go to the workers, and that was Marx's idea. But behind that is that you have this idea, you can change, and what you do to change is you change the material structures, and the human being is pliable, flexible. You change the structures, the human being's going to change where they are. They don't have an essential essence. Now, I put a little bullet at the bottom of this page 5. If your dialogue partner says everything is always about power, then everything will always have some political implication. You want to know why politics is such a big deal today? You want to know why politics is in every conversation almost today? It's because there is those who've been influenced by Marx that fundamentally think that everything is really materialistic and everything is really about the distribution of power. And so they're always worried about the distribution of power. And so whenever you talk to them, it's always the issue of, I don't want to talk to you about morality. I don't want to talk to you about what's going on in the individual human heart. I want to talk to you about the systems that are oppressive. And so this Marx has this influence of pushing us towards being more political. Darwin of this, and moving on to page 6. Another thing here, and this is probably significant as far as kind of a precursor with Marx when we get into the story of transgenderism. In Marx, other than practical differences between men and women, all are essentially workers. And what he theorized is that when technologies advance so that the differences between what a woman can do and a man can do in the workplace are equalized, then it really won't matter if you're a man or a woman, because what really matters about you is a worker. Now, out of this, technology can change things, and technology can change you, and the fundamental differences between a man and a woman really are inconsequential. Do you see the connection between that idea and the move of, if I feel like I'm a man on the inside, but I have the woman parts on the outside, what's really true about me is what I experience on the inside? And so therefore I can change, and if it's just an issue of technology, that doesn't really matter, and now we have the technology and let's do it. Marx helps open the door to that, which is opening the door to this sense of, there's not something essential for me to find out about myself out there. I'm going to find out about myself in there, and then I'm going to change the out there to conform to what's the in here. With Marx, religion and moral codes all help maintain the status quo, which needs to be undone, so that humanity can move into a better system, which for him was socialism. Marx is also part of the impetus towards revolution. The society needs to be changed. What we're presently experiencing in Western civilization is a repressive structure of oppressive power. And now he thought it was going to come about naturally, and we're going to get to a group of people who didn't, but there you go. And finally then, for Marx, religion and moral codes all help maintain the status quo. The critical spirit, the suspension that metaphysical claims are not innocent or morally neutral as they may appear, thus finds a philosophical foundation, Marx, dialectic materialism, as in Nietzsche. Nietzsche and Marx both saw religion as an enemy towards the revolution. And Marx is most famous with his comments of religion is that, that religion is an opium of the masses. It's a nuanced phrase. But behind it all, he really did see that Christianity and religion was getting in the way of where the world needed to go, and the world would be a better place ultimately without them. You move forward to Darwin. We're talking about the plausibility of self-creation. You can become whoever you want to be. There's not an external authority out there, but it's going to come from within. And Darwin undercut teleology. There's a designer. We don't need a designer. You've been cut off. You don't have to look to God for who you are or your calling. And then last week we did spend time talking about, okay, so we've got these forces in play, but why has sex become such a dominant part of our cultural expression? And what I argued for is that a part of the answer to that has to start with Freud. Because what Freud did is that he was part of, the father of psychoanalysis. Most people don't follow any of his theories about how you actually do therapy or understand how psychoanalysis really works anymore, because his was kind of more armchair philosophy than any empirical study. But he had some powerful ideas. He was moving towards the same movement in the direction of the Romantics about looking inward. And then he offered this. The place of true happiness for human beings is sexual gratification. And our sense of identity is that we are basically sexual beings. And sex is a powerful force. It is something that when you experience it, it affirms, I'm alive. And I think I said this at the end of last week as we're ending here, but one of my favorite Christian thinkers of the late 20th century, early 21st century was Dallas Willard. And Dallas Willard is a philosopher, but a Christian, and he really focused in on living the Christian life, being a disciple. And he made this observation: if you are spiritually dead and you're not alive to God, there is this question: how can I affirm that I am really alive? What ties me to life? And the next most powerful thing out of God's Spirit that tells you that you're alive is your body. And so you move towards being essentialist. And when we look at our society and we see its obsession with sex, part of that is a diagnosis of its spiritual deadness, that it doesn't realize that it could be alive to God. And so it's finding its affirmation in just these physical things. So notice how I did this. So, we're looking at how did we get here? Why is sex the answer? Why is sex such a central part of both our identity, expressive individualism, and it begins with Freud. And I've added a little bit of information. I think, Phil, can you help me out? I think I'm going to be on page 7. It begins.
I think you're at the bottom of 7.
Well, I'm on the one where it has the bullet Rousseau, and it's at the top of the page. So maybe that's 8. Okay, so page 8. Rousseau saw unhappiness as the result of the corrupting power of civilized society. By moralizing self-love, which prevented people from being true to themselves and forcing them to follow artificial conventions. Freud stands in congruity, but he sexualizes and darkens it. The problem is that we have natural sexual desires that will lead us to be happy, and civilized society restricts us from fulfilling those desires. Further, the natural man is dark, violent, irrational. Thus, we gave up our happiness for security. We forfeited true happiness, free sexual expression, so that we could be safe. This is Freud in some of his mature thinking, but he's at this place where he believes that the central thing that will make human beings happy is sex. And what it means is you having sex however you want to have sex. There should be no moral codes. But Freud looks at it and he says, well, but in reality we needed to give up just being able to do whatever we want to do because, well, there is darkness and brokenness in people, and so we need civilization to help provide some taboos so that we can be guarded against some of those extreme dark forces. Because even if it would be fulfilling for us, there's a trade-off of I want to be able to live and I don't want to die, so okay, I'll give up some of my freedom. But it's still a limiting factor. Now, well, this is kind of where we ended last week, and I want to add a little bit to this because I think it's important for us to kind of understand the next section. If sexual satisfaction is central to who we are, what about children? And we talked about this, is that before this, children are seen as being sexual innocents, like little children. But if sexuality and your sexual identity doesn't emerge until after puberty, how is it an essential part of who you are? And so Freud came back and he theorized, no, sex really is the most important thing. And even children are sexual. And this will maybe shock some of you, but as we move further into people who are influenced by Freud, if you want to know why we find sexually explicit material in public libraries and school libraries in elementary school, it begins with Freud and this idea that children are sexual beings and their sexuality is being suppressed by their parents, and their parents are suppressing them because they represent the hierarchical power of society and the people who have power and want to keep power. Now, I say this stuff and I sit there and I go, it sounds like a little bit of a conspiracy theory, but that's what the writing is about. Phil.
I recently was reminded of Dr. Benjamin Spock, and I remember at my age, my parents, my mom, she was heavily influenced by Spock, and I think a lot of the moms at that point back, in the 50s, 60s, were. Where did he fit into this, do you know? Because he seemed to have quite an influence in our culture with child raising.
I don't know where Spock, Doctor, that it kind of hits me right in the area where his influence on society was short-lived. It didn't, so he had an influence on a generation. I was little at the time, or even it wasn't quite, but right in that time period. So, but and that's the part where there's a lot more names that we could point to, but we're pointing at some of the big names that ended up influencing all of us. At page 9, sorry, I think it's the same slide on top and bottom. For Freud, there is no objective moral standard. All morality is merely personal preference placed upon children who come to believe they must be subject to these preferences. again, that's a common strain in this. There are no moral absolutes. Morality is just a preference. It is something that's put upon you. It's used as a means of control. Morality inflicts people with shame so that people will maintain the status quo. Let's move forward to page 10. We did cover this stuff last week.
The bottom slide there, that was almost all the same. There was one additional sentence added.
Let's see. In his later writings, we see a frustrated compromise of repressing the sex drive so that humans can survive in society. And that was the part where that statement that I made earlier about him, that you basically, there's a compromise that you make so that you can be safe. That's a place that he finally got to. In the beginning, he was trying to figure out how might we be able just to do whatever we want to do. But he finally came to a place of that sort of compromise. This next section, why is sex the answer? Sigmund Freud, kind of a summary, understanding the attraction of Freud. Why was Freud so influential? Part of it was the idiom, the language of science. The way that he described things was in a type of a scientific way, and science was the place of truth. And so when he was able to examine these things, it was persuasive. Now, there's an approach towards psychology today that's very empirical in nature, where you do a whole bunch of studies and you do surveys and you do different things and you can analyze and you can see how people are. Freud wasn't doing any of that stuff. He made observations. He met with people. He asked questions, but this was not hard science, but it had the appearance of science. And so, for example, what he's famous for is the id, the ego, and the superego. And an id is your just your instinctual self. It's your beginning of your identity. Your ego is what grows and develops, and it kind of manages the id, and the superego is really the influence of the larger society and how it tries to shape you. Nobody really buys into that anymore, but we know the language of it. But that's where this was persuasive. It was descriptive. It makes a little bit of sense. Okay. Similarly, the stages of sexual development. This was the part where he justified. He had these 3 essays on sexual progression, sexual development. And in this, he talks about, okay, kids are sexual beings. They begin with oral, they move to anal, then phallic, and then after the phallic, there's a little bit of this time where they're just kind of in a latent period, and then they finally move into the genital, and that becomes post-puberty. It had the appearance of scientific rigor, but again, it was conjecture. Realize, though, that if you go back to the Romantics, they were saying a lot of what Freud was saying, that to be human is to be sexual, and to be sexual is to be happy, and we just want to do, Shelley said the very same sorts of things as Freud. His just wasn't quite as persuasive in one way, because it wasn't in the language of science, it was in the language of poetry. Now, here's another reason why Freud is attractive. If sexual fulfillment is the essence of human happiness, we do not have to wait for ultimate fulfillment. It's available today. As in contrast to the Christian gospel that says right now we're in between times. Right now, we can have a relationship with God, but we live in a dark world that's broken. And until Jesus returns, our fundamental Christian hope is looking forward to a city that hasn't yet come. And one of the features of our society is we become very impatient, and we want instant gratification. And we become more sensualist, more materialist, more hedonistic, as we were talking about last week of just describing our culture. And then there becomes this. How do we explain away religion and morality? And remember, they had lived through the Victorian age, and there was quite a concern for sexual mores in the Victorian age. but there is also this push of jettisoning it all. Religion and morality are infantile neuroses born out of wish fulfillment to make our helplessness tolerable. That's directly the language of Freud. I'm just quoting him there. And then what happens is see, now, if you progress and become mature, and you're intellectual, and civilized and refined, you can dismiss religion as merely childish neuroses of people who just haven't grown up into the reality of the modern age, and they're holding on to these, these infantile taboos. But you and we're better than that. Freud gives scientific respectability to the idea that religious belief represents some form of mental deficiency or emotional immaturity. Oh, you rubes, right? Oh, you people who are backwards, you just haven't caught up to the 21st century yet. And here is a direct link to this idea that if you just don't understand the sexual revolution, it's not that you have a rational argument, that there's something wrong with you, that you just haven't developed, you haven't grown up. It's some sort of a phobia. It's an irrational fear. Okay. How did we get here? The next section. Is this page, which page am I on? 9? 10. Bottom of page 10. The revolution begins, critical theory. Now, critical theory is not critical race theory. I know critical race theory is a big thing. Critical theory is the roots of critical race theory. Critical theory helps give some of the philosophical foundational ideas and approaches that then gets applied at the level of race and becomes known as critical race theory. Critical theory goes back to the 1920s. It gets associated with one school in particular, the Frankfurt School. I haven't given you all that language in here. I've given you a couple of the names of the big people. What critical theory does is it takes the idea of Marx and it takes the idea of Freud and it marries them together, and then it says we've got to make a revolution and we've got to change society, and it is going to be a revolution that overcomes the oppressive past. And this political revolution is also going to be a sexual revolution. Critical theorists sit there and say Marx was mostly right. The world is divided up between those who have power and those who do not. The dominant Western narrative of truth is really a way for those with power to keep their power. So it says, listen, there is no moral absolute truth. That truth is just an issue of power. When people make absolute truth claims, it's because they want power in some way. We know they're self-defeating in that. They're making absolute truth claims, but there you go. Marx underestimated the power of capitalism to lull the masses. So there was two things that happened. Marx assumed that in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, the workers were finally going to get so fed up that they were going to rise up, and then in some way, everything was going to go to the workers, and the masses were going to control everything, all the means of production, and there you go. And now there wouldn't be all these different people with a few people having everything, and then everybody being subject to them. When the Russian Revolution under Lenin began, it looked like Marx was right. And then Stalin emerged. And Stalin really frustrated things for Marxists because Stalin was an oppressive, terrible dictator, and this thing that was going to be the freedom of all the people became the worst nightmare that you could imagine. And so these people who are still holding on to the Marxist dream are sitting there and they're looking at this and they're saying, how did we get here? And what they said is, you know what the real problem is? It's patriarchy. It's the nuclear family. Because the nuclear family sets up and trains children to obey authority. And so when you have a really authoritative person, everybody just goes along and listens to the person, even though that person's really bad. This is their basic critique. So you've got that problem, and then you've got America. And they went through the Industrial Revolution, and so did Great Britain, but especially America, and the workers never rose up. They got, well, a middle class. they got fat and lazy. Not, you know, I mean, but, you know, I mean, that was the thing, was they got lulled into it. And so then you began to have this thing with these critical theorists who are Marxists at their roots. Marx wasn't absolutely correct. We're going to have to do something. And there became different schools of thought within critical theory about how we might do something. One person early on sat there and said, well, the way that it's going to work itself out is there's going to be a few select intellectuals who are going to bring the ideas to the masses, and then they'll transform. And the big way that you do this is you take over some of the structures of society, like educating children. Sound familiar?
Tim Ford wants to know if does Marx welcome mob democracy?
What's the question?
I hear that.
Does Marx welcome mob democracy?
Does Marx welcome mob democracy? He was more optimistic than that. I mean, I mean, again, it's a little bit like the sense of Rousseau. Inherently, the worker is a good person, and it's the oppression of society that's the problem. And so if we can give, if we practically can give all the material resources back to all the workers and they share it in common, the world will become some sort of a utopia. And so they weren't looking for mob chaos, but with all of those things, you look at it and you go, is that the best explanatory story of the world? And when we come back to this, and when we realize that there are people in our society who are pushing critical theory, and who are pushing, you know, when critical theory is going to be part of the sexual revolution, they don't realize all the background. They just see, you know, they're coming out of expressive individualism. They're coming out from this place of, you know, this person just wants to be who they want to be, and wouldn't it be fair and kind and stuff like that. But they may not fully think through all the implications of where these people came from. Like, do you think that the only problem in the world is out there? Or do you feel like there's something broken in here? I mean, and, you know, I think it was Marion who mentioned it last week. You know, I mean, if everybody's perfect in here, then how did out there ever get the way that it is? Because you'd think it would be perfect out there if we're all perfect in here.
How can perfect people
Make an imperfect society, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So this becomes a part where all of us should be searchers for truth, and even if the person doesn't believe there's absolute truth, sit there and say, well, how do we best align with reality, and what claims should we believe in? And this becomes the part about trying to understand their stories, even if they don't know the origin of their stories or what's shaping them, because it's shaping all of us, because this is our society. But then to say, and the way of Jesus is something vastly different. But Jesus is neither a capitalist nor a socialist. And so, you know, we're not sitting here and inherently saying, well, I'm going to defend all of the principles of capitalism. And I'm not going to defend all of the principles of socialism. But I am going to sit there and try to name truth, and one of the truths is that anarchy is really bad for human flourishing.
Ralph, it seems to me too, another kind of proof of the whole error of this way of thinking is the 75 years of the Great Russian Revolution experiment. You know, maybe for a few years, most everybody had the same things, everything in common. But how long did that last? Eventually, it seems like might makes right. People learn to game the system. Some people become wealthier and others poorer. It just doesn't, this equality type thing doesn't just naturally sustain itself. It's not sustainable.
So Phil's commenting and saying, you know, when we look back historically, one of the things that we see is that the way of socialism doesn't end up working in practicality, because what ends up happening is that there's a few people who have the power, and then everybody else suffers under their tyranny. And in every expression where you have full-fledged socialism being done, that's what we've seen thus far. Now,
Not
Critical-
only Soviet Union, but Cuba, China.
Critical theory started in the 20s. It continues today. And there's probably two parts to this that need to be. And part of what they're looking at is to say that has been true, for example, like with Stalin. And we're not advocating for a socialism like Stalin because that's really just despotism. But it's not necessarily the case, is it? And there's a little bit of an idealism here. But critical theory does something which it explains, where we're getting to in our own society is remember, it's not just Marx. It's the marrying of Marx with Freud. And in this, they have come to the idea that central to this revolution that we need to move forward to is sexual liberation. And that human flourishing is really your sexual expression. And that's where we get this sexual identity as this huge part of our culture. Because this idea of critical theory, this is what's been in the West, both in Europe and in America. The writers have been talking, and in it has a revolutionary push of it wants to see change in our societies. It's not satisfied. Now, what's happened is, and this is in your notes, is with Marx, there was economic, and I put economic all in capital letters, oppression. For the critical theory, oppression is the problem, and one way you see it is economics, and another way you see it is among gender, and another way that you see it is among race, and another way that you see it is among sexism. And so now, with critical theory, it's much more the story of victimhood and oppression, and how do we overcome oppression. And the reality is that we do have an oppressive world and oppressive systems.
I think you're over to page 13 now, Robert.
Well, and I'm going to walk through. I'm sorry, it's all in my head, and when I get to 13, I will go a little bit faster. Marx underestimated the power of capitalism to lull the masses, and then critical theory. This is important. Bottom of page 11, 10. Last bullet. Critical theory married the socialist optimistic view of Marx with the individual pessimistic view of Freud. That's quite an accomplishment. Remember that Marx is looking at the social dynamics of people groups. Freud was looking at the individual. Marx had an optimistic sense. Ultimately, there's going to be a utopia. Freud was much more pessimistic. Critical theory is able to marry those two things together. There needs to be a revolution to get society right. If happiness is tied to sexual gratification, if we repress sex to form society, who is to say this trade-off is necessary? So Freud sat there and said, well, it's a necessary thing, influenced by Marx, but not all the way by Marx, but going along. Critical theories come into this and say, well, it could be true in this civilization that you have to have a trade-off, that you just can't do whatever you want to do sexually. But that's only because this is an oppressive patriarchy. But if we could get to a different sort of society, then you could be free to do whatever you want to do sexually. And in this, you're seeing the tying together of sex and politics and oppression and freedom and sexual identity. And this is why I'm saying it's the roots of the sexual revolution. And because of the Marxist idea, if we can transform the structures of society, the way people actually live, then people will change their minds and they'll become different. So let's say that we want to move from this very repressive, Victorian, no sex at all, and we want to become erotic. Well, let's start introducing eroticism into the culture. And you know where we're headed, right? In one way, they were right. They have changed the mores of our society when it comes to sex. And it has been the slow beat down, wear down of all of this sexual stuff that keeps getting thrown at us all of the time. And some of it feels good. People do it. It's not that bad. Okay. how's this going? Is this, I mean, I'm giving you a lot of stuff again, aren't I? I mean, but is it, now, some of this, understand it's an introduction. I'm a historian, but my focus was always ancient history. I hadn't read anything on critical theory in any of my classes. So I'm learning stuff in this. I'm like, huh. I mean, I knew Eric Fromm, but I didn't realize that he was at the Frankfurt School or this stuff was going on. I didn't. Now, and so this becomes this part where it's just a little bit of us kind of beginning to learn. I knew about the sexual revolution, but I didn't understand the roots of the sexual revolution, and I didn't understand the real revolutionary idea of really trying to radically transform the entire political structure. Because critical theory is tied to Marxism. It is a move away from capitalism. It is a move to socialism. Reich is one of the early and most influential writers of critical theory. And he writes, current repressive sexual codes are intimately connected to the exploitation of labor. This is a quote from him. The interlacing of the socioeconomic structure with the sexual structure of society and the structural reproduction of society take place in the first 4 or 5 years. And in the authoritarian, and I put patriarchal because that becomes the more popular language after Reich, family. The church only continues this function later. Thus, the authoritarian state gains enormous interest in authoritarian family. It becomes the factory in which the state structures and ideologies are molded. And what Reich theorizes back in the early 1930s is what we have to do is we have to overthrow the influence of the nuclear family over the children, because this is why people go along with this authoritarianism. If we're going to radically change the society, we have to disenfranchise the power of parents over their kids. I had no idea. Man. And that's been being talked about and discussed for 90 years.
So when he says the first 4 or 5 years, he's talking about in the child's life?
He's talking about in the child's life. And he's identifying that, you see, we want to point to the church, but the church is just one part of the problem. The real part of the problem is the nuclear family, because those kids get indoctrinated that they follow the orders of their parents, who are brainwashing them with the values of the patriarchy.
Ralph,
Yes.
one thing I had heard, and I have no source for this, because this is before the internet.
Okay.
In the 80s, I heard that what the Soviet Union tried to do was take children after a certain age and put them into nurseries, so that the people that were good at taking care of children would do that job, and then their parents would do something else. And what I had heard is this was a failed experiment because too many of the children died from lack of
Nurture. Yeah.
nurturing.
I mean, what we know is that, there's a whole thing of attachment disorders that occur.
Yeah, and I have never, I looked for it briefly once, and I could never find that.
Now, here's the interesting thing, and just so you know, when it comes to this stuff, it's continued to develop. These are early ideas. It's shaped the movement. It is tied into both psychology and sociology, and they continue to interact with those disciplines as they think about how to move the structures forward. This is the part where you look at this. These people are believers. They believe that the world is broken. So do we. But they believe that there is no hope looking to God because God doesn't exist. So we've got to do something. And oppression is the problem, so how do we do it? And I'll give you like an example of something that I just heard, and this is, this is an easy thing to check. But one of the best-selling books right now is How to Be Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. And what he says in his book is that how you have to overcome racism is by being racist. And if you want to overcome racism, you not only have to be racist now, but you need to be racist in the future. because he's working through this lens that critical race theory is structured by from critical theory, that the main issue is the imbalance of power. And so what we need to do is we need to take power from these people who are the oppressive people, which is whiteness, and we need to redistribute it. And that's going to be racist in its nature, but that's the only way that we can get to the place. And there is this part where, well, if you want to make an omelet, you're going to have to break some eggs. There may be some things that you're going to have to sacrifice so that we can bring about the revolution, so we can overcome the oppression of our present system, and they're willing to do it.
Of course, when I heard this, at the same time that the Soviet Union was experiencing such a population drop, that they were rewarding women that had more than 10 children.
Wow. Thank you. I mean, that's the part where what Marion was sharing about in that was just kind of at least something that's been said. I've heard something like that. They were doing some experiments about really taking children away from parents and having other people do the basic care while the parents then did other work. And it fits the Marxist model. You're a laborer. What's your best labor at? And there you go.
And it didn't entirely work.
Yes, it never does. If there needs to be a revolution to get society right, if happiness is tied to sexual gratification, if we repress sex to form society, who is to say this trade-off is necessary? And this is the part where it's like, wait a second, Freud was wrong. He assumed that we had to do this, but no, not necessarily. In the patriarchal system you do, but if you could get to another one, and this is where with Reich, his revolution is a sexual revolution. His book in 1930 was called, I think I have the quote there, oh, that's mass psychology. He has a book that was called The Sexual Revolution, and he was calling for this sort of thing. The interlacing of, okay, I've read those things. Moving on to, Phil, what page am I on? 12. Reich's premise that the traditional family unit is the vehicle of oppression stands in line with both some of the Romantics and the Marxist thinkers. What Reich does is radicalize and psychologize the notion by using Freud to explain it. The family makes people weak to authoritarian figures. Thus, for many Marxist thinkers, now influenced by critical theory, the dismantling and abolition of the nuclear family are essential if political liberation is to be achieved. And what I'm giving you there is a picture about the influence that this has all the way up to the present time. And again, there's a variedness in this. This is the part where this is spread across universities. There's different thinkers, there's different writers, they have their theories. And you will find different people kind of coming at this, but this basic idea, some people hold strongly to it. It is something that many people are willing to say, this is one of the ways that we're going to bring about the change of society, is radically changing the relationship between parents and their kids. Now, I think that we've already begun to see some of the impact of this. This is the part where my 15-year-old daughter can sit there and tell us that we have no right to be in the doctor's office with her when she is meeting. And a big part of this is so that she can express her own sexual freedom, so that she can be experimenting with who she is as a sexual being and not have her parents' authority get in the way of the conversations that she has about contraception or anything else. That wasn't true 50 years ago, was it? No. How did we get there? This. For Marxist thinkers now influenced by, okay, I think I did that one. In this system, working class people must be disabused of their commitment to the bourgeoisie sexual codes that make the traditional family an unquestioned and necessary good. All of those things, sexual mores, the significance of marriage, a family, those are all getting in the way of the revolution that needs to take place. Reich wrote The Sexual Revolution in 1936, and he outlines that Freud was correct in seeing the sexual repression as a basis for civilization, but was incorrect in generalizing this of all cultures. What needs to happen is sex education for children and adolescents that liberates them from their parents' control and allows them to explore their inherent sexual freedoms. And I would argue that we're beginning to see this as far as what the approach is in education, and this is the roots of it. I'm shocked when I sit there and hear that they're talking to elementary school kids about how to do masturbation. And you say, what? And with that, what it's coming to is to say they're a sexual being, and it's oppressive for them not to express themselves sexually. And so, and the parents just are still, stuck back in that patriarchal oppressive system, and they just don't realize what we realize. Wright believed that the state must be used to coerce families and even punish those who dissent from sexual liberation being proposed. I think it was in Australia this last month. The courts removed a child from the family because the parents didn't go along with the child identifying as of the opposite gender, and because the child was identifying as transgender, they moved the child out of the home. I've heard that there's been a couple similar cases in the U.S. of something like that happening. So, now, one of the questions, and we're going to get there, how do we get there? Well, that's the triumph of the therapeutic. What's most important is my identity and how I feel about myself. I mean, that's what therapy does. And this becomes the part where, and if you're getting in the way of how I feel, and if you're attacking me and making me feel bad, and this is the part where now we're, the attack on free speech. This is violence. That's hurtful, hateful speech. And for people who are older, who growing up in America, free speech is the First Amendment, and it's an inherent good, and it's absolutely essential for liberty to be maintained. We sit there and we're going, what's going on? Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can't hurt me. That's what I get that emotionally they can hurt, but there's a big difference between that. But that's not where all of our society is at today. In marrying these ideas with Freud and indicating that the oppression is psychological, it becomes both much more subjective and much more arbitrary. And that becomes some of the danger of what we're seeing encoded in hate speech. And now hate speech is you just disagreeing with me. And this becomes a threat, and we've seen it hasn't been in America because we've had such a strong commitment to free speech. But, there have been pastors who've been arrested for preaching the gospel that says that you need to repent from your sins. Now, what's big here is we're listening to this, and it's this part about understanding that this is the worldview some people are living out of. And so when they hear these things, they automatically assume that there can't be any rational basis. You just hate me, and you're rejecting me. And my sense of sexual identity, my sense of sex is so caught up with my identity that anything that you say against my sexual practices is against me. It's not just what I do, but it's against me. It's essentially who I am. And then this is page 13. From Marx, there needs to be a revolution, but critical theory reverses the emphasis from economic oppression to oppression. And critical theory is branched out into a number of different disciplines. And so it's economic, sexual, racial, gender. And then this has had an influence in all of our studies. So now you talk about post-colonialism, and you'll talk about, feminism has been impacted by these things. And all of these different, and history has been impacted, and psychology and sociology. Now this is kind of important. What you do in the bedroom is no longer private. It is social and political. Patterns of private sexual behavior are not simply private, they are public and political because they constitute a significant part of how our culture thinks, not things, thinks of identity. To outlaw gay sex or to merely tolerate a certain identity, both are ultimately seen as forms of oppression. Just so you know, Reich back in the 1930s anticipates this thinking, but this is where we are today. Reich believed that socio-political reform without sexual liberation is impossible. This is where critical theory says the way to change our culture is going to be through a sexual revolution. What happened in the 60s was being worked towards. Where Reich wanted to loosen all sexual mores, Reich came at this and he said, there are really no sexual mores. Okay, well, there's one. And it's like little kids shouldn't be forced to have sex with older people. But he had no rational basis for saying it. It was just the remnants of the reality of Christian morality, and he was just looking at that. But he was very much saying, it can be whatever. The next big name that I'm going to introduce you to is Herbert Marcuse. He was contemporary of Reich. He argued that some repression is necessary. But as civilization advances, you need less repression. But if civilization is not where you want it, you will need some repression to get where you want to go. And so Marcuse looked at this and he said, no. There's been times people just do whatever they want, a little bit like Freud. There's going to be a payoff. You can allow for some repression. But only until society gets to the place where then everybody can just do whatever they want to do. But if we have to repress some people to get the society to the place that people can do whatever they want to do sexually, that's okay too. And this is very much, again, you don't have morality or any Christian sense of power and how to use power directing this, so this becomes coercive power. And we're feeling this in our society today. And this becomes the laws of hate speech and very directive senses about now protecting people from, hate speech or any sort of intolerance and things like that. Because oppression is now primarily psychological, identity, and internal, words and ideas are the most powerful weapons for good or ill. Words are powerful. But who decides what's verboten? Verboten means cannot be spoken. And what you see is this, this is the part where, when we talk about cancel culture, what we're talking about is that when people hold certain ideas and they say certain things, then the people with power will silence them, punish them. Is everybody seeing this? And then there's an interesting thing. Then you'll hear people on the news media say, well, there's really no cancel culture. But then they'll come back and say, well, but see, those people really deserved it. Because what they were saying was verboten. It cannot be spoken. Well, who says? Oh, the people with power. Oh, I get it. Critical theory now weaves its way into feminism, humanities, sociology, education, and race. Sexual freedoms become political freedom. Modesty and sexual codes need to be abolished. The power and influence of the family needs to be undone. Sexual morality cannot, in this worldview, cannot be removed from the question of human identity. This is critical theory is the roots of sitting there and going, the way that I express myself and the way that I identify myself is by my sexual expression. So I give you kind of an overview on this next slide of all of these things together. The loss of God, the emergence of victimhood, expressivism, what is really real is what I feel, that comes from the Romantics, the plausibility of self-creation, Nietzsche, Marx, Darwin, sex is the key to human happiness, Freud, the roots of the sexual revolution, critical theory, tying these things together. Now, here's where we are. The triumph of the erotic. Sex now pervades every aspect of life, from elementary education to commercials to how we write laws. You've heard of SOGI laws. These are, and to the ruling of the Supreme Court. Two key movements that moved it from critical theory to reality. The first one you may not think about, but it's Surrealism. Surrealism was an art movement. Again, remember, just like with the Romantics, art is a powerful medium that is evocative, that touches the emotions, that gets us to start experience things. The unconscious is the guide to truth and individual authenticity. That is at the hallmark of Surrealism. It is the decisive battle, Surrealists saw this, was against Christianity, and it must be fought only at the level of the sexual revolution. And Surrealism ultimately opened the door of making pornography not just acceptable, but seen as a positive good. And then that moves us forward, the pornification of mainstream culture. This is all about the triumph of the erotic. What you are is a sexual being, and you should express yourself sexually. It's mostly just about you and what your experience is. Roots of it, Playboy, Hollywood, the internet. You know, I mean, if you want to look at, just kind of Playboy opened the door, and then you start to have Hollywood, and then and all of these things were forces that really then began to introduce more of the ideas of the sexual revolution, of through Will and Grace, bringing homosexuals into your living room, the modern family, all of these things of just breaking down the barriers of going, oh, those people are just like us, and they are humans. And, and I've had the opportunity to have different relationships and even a few friendships with people who identify as homosexual. But again, they're coming at it as that if you can't affirm my lifestyle, then you hate me. And it's just like, there's a whole bunch of people that I love that I don't affirm their lifestyles in all different ways. And this has nothing to do about hate. This has to do about morality, but they're not functioning out of my story and my worldview. Now, pornography. This is this part about thinking about what it has done. Pornography focuses us as an individual actor detaching sex from real bodily encounters. Here's one of the things, and I have preached before on lovemaking. And our understanding of a sexual ethic, and I'll teach about it. When I teach biblically, I always talk about love making. I don't just use the word sex, because sex is really something of our modern creation. Of it just becomes more focused on this exchange, and it's kind of what the individual does. But real sex is a gift that's given in the context of a husband and wife, that a husband and wife are joined together in physical lovemaking, and this is a gift from God, and it's a beautiful thing, and it's wonderful in its place. But pornography turns it into something you do as an individual for personal gratification. And it divorces it from both any sense of story, any sense of relationship, any sense of two people. It becomes the individual and their exchange. And it starts to shape the way that we view sex. And there's all of this proof out there about just how pernicious and awful pornography is for people. And yet, it has been normalized, it is accepted. There's all these different articles, there's all this education that just promotes. This is even this part where I was reading one of these things in this, and there was a Christian minister who was talking about something like ethically appropriate pornography, where the actors involved willingly did what they were doing, and they weren't being oppressed in what normally is done with pornography. And so that's an ethical form, and it's good.
Well, and that's what they're saying now about legalizing sex trafficking, or not sex trafficking, but prostitution and those kinds of things, because they're not oppressed. It's because it's just the way they want to make their living, and they have the right to do that.
Right. And the comment for those online is that, and is the shifting mores when it comes to prostitution. And now, we don't even want to, we won't call it prostitution, we'll call it a sex worker in the sex trade. And all it is a means of labor, and that's the way that you make your income. And then we're going to think about how we say the language so it's less offensive. Now, you and I as Christians, this is coming out of Marxism. Marxism is materialistic. They don't believe in God. They don't believe in spirit. Now, most of the people who are caught up into this, they believe there's a God. They believe there's a spirit. They don't understand that this movement, which is coming out of this godlessness, doesn't understand the way that the Bible says humans are made, and that part of the reason that God says no to making love outside of marriage is it ruins us, it hurts us, it's not good. Because they've reduced us. And in the end, the pornification of our culture trivializes the meaning of lovemaking. I mean, it's really tragic. It gets attached not just from bodily interaction, but from interpersonal narrative. It becomes an isolating event with no other inherent meaning than the satisfaction of the moment. And that's just a very brief picture, but I think, the way that our society approaches sex, we talked about a little bit of, and I didn't put it in your notes, but Lowell, you asked about this, about like past pagan cultures. And I said, I think there is a difference. And one of the things that I didn't mention last week on this one is, in every pagan culture, that interaction of sex in some way had to do with touching the transcendence. It was something that was bringing us in connection to that which is greater than we are. In our society, there is no transcendence. It is merely something that you do for self-fulfillment and gratification, and it makes the me more selfish and bigger. The triumph of the therapeutic. In one of the books that I read, what he broke down is with the therapeutic, it's the fact that we essentially approach people through this sense of being a psychological person, and what's probably most important about you is your own inner sense of who you are on the inside. Now, this opening statement that I have here comes from Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania versus Casey, which I think is 1992, and it's a Supreme Court ruling. And in that Supreme Court ruling, they sided with abortion, but more importantly, they gave this definition: at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. Belief about these matters could not define the attributes of personhood where they formed under the compulsion of the state. You should be able to be free to just basically determine anything that you want to be. Now, they use this because it was in line with the direction that they wanted the culture to go. But this statement is so broad, it's almost meaningless, because we all know that there are limitations where we still say, wait a second, even if you feel like that, that doesn't mean you can do it because you live in a society. But this becomes the part where what we have seen over time, even in the way that we have done laws, is that when it comes to the sexual revolution, it always triumphs of allowing people to do what they want to do. And so, like the redefinition of marriage, where the federal government and the Supreme Court came in the case of Obergefell and said, okay, we're going to now say that marriage can be not just between a man and a woman, but between a man and a man and a woman and a woman. And in it, and it was in this case as well, and then in the ones that leading up to it, as far as setting these precedences where they're trying to create laws that allow them to do whatever they sexually want to do, there becomes this sense of you as a person should be able to do whatever you feel like doing, especially when it comes to sex. And if, for example, there was a Supreme Court ruling over the Defense of Marriage Act, where there was actually a federal congressional vote that Clinton signed that said that marriage is just between a man and a woman, and it was a response to this ruling, which was opening the door saying you can kind of do whatever you want to do then. And they ultimately found the Defense of Marriage Act unconstitutional because of personal animus against people who are homosexual. You want to limit them from doing something that they want to do, and the only justification that you have is you don't like them. And, you know, and it'd be like, no, that's not what we're saying at all. We don't believe that that's what marriage is. But they don't understand it. And the majority, that's the way that they phrased it. It was an issue of just personal animus and prejudice. And that takes us full circle. We get to this question. Why is Christianity homophobic and transphobic? And what you need to understand is when they're asking that, they're really sincere. In their worldview, the way that they've been shaped, they don't have any other sense than just assuming that you have some irrational fear, that you don't have any reason whatsoever, you just don't like them. And it's going to be hard because, you know, and I have some suggestions for us. And let's see here. I'm on now. Question: isn't Christianity homophobic or transphobic? Why are we talking about phobia? We have good arguments that Christianity is not homophobic or transphobic. These questions, whether those asking them know or not, are built on a worldview that assumes, and this is where you and I need to know this. They probably don't hold all these things. They probably don't know all of these things. This is the part where we're talking about the roots of ideas that are hundreds of years old, that are in philosophers that most people don't read anymore, but are influential in the field. There are no objective morals. Except nobody really lives that out. There are some things that are just wrong, like racism. And we all agree, racism is wrong. Is that objectively true? Well, most people would say yes. But in your worldview, this is coming out of the idea that there really are no objective morals. Or what you want to say is there should be no sexual morals. But nobody really believes that either. I mean, the Me Too movement is this great, stand up against it and say, wait a second, women shouldn't be oppressed sexually and they shouldn't be used sexually in those ways. But we should have reasons for skepticism because it does seem to be political, because they're much more concerned about one group of people having to follow along with Me Too than another group of people. But there are no objective morals. Religion, especially Christianity, are part of the problem. And so you, with your Christian beliefs, which is some form of infantile neurosis, or backwardsness, or inherent prejudice. What is most important to my identity is what I feel. And in the feeling part, it doesn't even need to be rational anymore. It's what I just know this because I feel it.
Well, it's interesting what it's doing to our culture. I was just listening to a report that toy stores are going to start mixing toys. We won't have a girl section or a boys section, but that also some stores will be doing that with clothing, so that if you're a trans individual, you don't have to feel uncomfortable going into the opposite sex designated clothing area. So I'm trying to figure out if I want to find a shirt. I guess I'm just going to go to the shirt area and look for.
Yeah, and the comment that Shannon is making is that, it's coming out of this therapeutic mindset of being concerned about your feelings, and then people feel marginalized, and so we want to try, and there's a good intention in that, but then it goes to this thing, but see, what you need to understand is that there's really no essential difference between boys and girls, men and women. And let's not bring that oppressiveness on them. So let's start changing things. So let's wipe out. And if you want to have a boys section and a girls section, now you're going to get in trouble.
Then which side are the buttons on your shirts going to be? Are they going to button one side?
Which side of the shirt are you going to button?
Whatever way the buttons are on the shirt that you like.
Well, one is male and one is female today, so that we just all go to t-shirts on.
If I had my guess, I would probably end up.
We have every other one.
No, one of the things to know is that a lot of this stuff is being driven by powerful people. And it's still a bunch of powerful white guys who are behind it all. So I'm going to guess it's going to go in the male direction. That's a guess.
Ralph,
For women who buy the clothes.
this may not help with resolution to what do we do about all this, but it seems to me that the real issue goes back to the first thing I talked about the culture that we live in. And those of us in this room are bicultural, because we live in a culture that's everything we're talking about here tonight, but we also are of the Christian culture, which has a very different, totally most fundamental view of man, of human beings, which the presupposition that is so radically different from theirs is that human beings, people, are not essentially good, and it's just been bad nurture or other external forces and influences that have held them back from all the goodness coming out and coming to any kind of utopian society. No, the problem is way back at the beginning that we are not essentially good in the first place.
It's one part of it.
Nature
It's
is
now see.
nature.
You guys are all in the sermon series with Romans.
Right.
So we don't lead with the bad news, we lead with the good news. But we've got some bad news. But the bad news is always trumped by the good news. So I wouldn't start your conversation with, what you need to understand is you're essentially broken. But eventually we're going to get there. But it may be me sharing my own vulnerabilities. You right? My own story. And and that becomes a part about the art of this. But at its root, it's recognizing the way forward really is going to be through personal relationships of friendship, because this sort of thing is going to take time, right? I mean, this was part of why I did it this way. Is I could present you in an hour arguments for why you could present that homosexuality is a sin according to the Bible. But it's not really going to help you, because they're so far from that place of accepting any idea of authority from Scripture that they're going to just experience it as a microaggression, where you're trying to hoist your beliefs onto me and tell me that I'm a bad person, and I don't want to hear it. I don't think I'm making this easy for us, but I am trying to this is the real dynamics of the world we're living in, and how do we navigate this stuff? And anything that limits my personal sexual oppression is repressive. But see, there's holes in these things. Further, it will be dismissive that any rational answer can exist, because rationalism is part of the problem. Now, you've heard this with critical race theory, right? Like math is inherently racist. Patriarchy is inherently racist. Rationalism is inherently racist. What? Roads. Oh, yeah, yes. Roads are inherent. And then the same thing. This is the part where all of this is the structure of Western civilization, which is built upon this capitalism, and you're using these things to retain power. Again, in some way they'll be influenced by it, but probably most people wouldn't be articulating all of this stuff. But there's a place for exploration. There's a place for questions. A way forward, build bridges. One of the things that we can build a bridge with is the affirmation of personal identity. Jesus knows you by name. Yeah. You may not know God, but I believe in a God who actually knows your name, and he wants to be in personal relationship with you. And he does want you to become the best version of who you are. One of the things to know is that part of the reason that we have individualism is because of Christianity. Because every other culture before the influence of Christ always began with the group. But Christianity holds this intention. You are part of a family, but you matter. Jesus died for you. You have gifts. The Holy Spirit wants to live in you. You are a temple of the Holy Spirit. You have a special part to play. Yes?
Back in surrealism, you said that Christianity is to be fought only over the sexual issues.
Yes.
And I think that is where people today see Christianity as just a bunch of no's, and they don't see
So
anything else.
I'm going to share this to people. So Marion was commenting in the comments on surrealism. The surrealist said the only way that you're going to fight Christianity is through the sexual revolution. And that's where a lot of people will be hearing this is they're hearing Christianity as a big no because it wants to limit my expressions as a sexual being. And it's going to come across as repressive. Part of this is a part of building bridges through friendship is when the relationship develops and if this person is coming from this side to begin to be able to say, you know, you may not like Christianity, but maybe what you really are disliking is just a caricature. I mean, that was my experience. I mean, and I can share that from my own testimony of thinking, I thought Christianity was about uptight, moralistic, boring people who just always kind of glared at everybody else. And you know, and then it was like, it's about life. Jesus wants me to really be alive, to live. It's about joy. It's about goodness. And so that becomes the part. But a bridge is the affirmation of personal identity. Coercive oppression is not the way towards human flourishing. They look at the problem and they say things are oppressive. We're absolutely in agreement. But one of the challenges is when the oppressed then are given power, they almost always become oppressors. And it seems to be that's what's happening in our society. Right at the issue of sexualism and the whole LGBTQ movement. I mean, the big thing today is the whole cancel culture. And if you say anything about transgenderism or any of those other things, you're going to get canceled. And there's, you know, and the big story here is Dave Chappelle, and you can't even say a joke. And I think most people are...
They'll cancel you for something you said 40 years ago.
They'll cancel you for something that you said 40 years ago. Right. Yeah. But what we can say is coercive oppression is not the way to human flourishing. And in fact, we believe in a God who refuses to use coercive power. And that means there's consequences. Some people don't believe. He didn't rape them. He didn't force them to love them. But he does want to rescue them. Neither capitalism nor socialism are the biblical ideal. You know, one of the things here is don't get so caught up in our culture that we are sitting there and we're defending capitalism over being a follower of Jesus. Now, every system has strengths and weaknesses. The weakness of socialism is that we humans are never going to be able to do it. In history, there's going to be people with power, and then the masses will suffer, and that's what we've seen so far. With capitalism, it inherently will move towards greed. And the value that's happened is that Christianity has been the offset in Western civilization, and it has basically retarded the greed. And so if you want capitalism to be a successful way for your society to flourish, you need the pull of a moral system which Christianity has offered. But again, capitalism in and of itself isn't the Christian ideal. We're resident aliens. We could live anywhere. But we want to live in a place and we want to advocate for a place that's more free. In practicality, I think capitalism is more free, but it's not the best system, and we should be willing to say, let's try to make things better. But don't use coercive power to do it. You may be surprised, but the Bible has a lot of positive things to say about making love. And, you know, that becomes one of those things about saying, if you understand the biblical teaching, we are not people who sit there and say, oh, you know, sex is a bad thing. It's a beautiful, wonderful gift in the proper place. Ask questions and listen. This is not a uniform movement. The goal is friendship, and dialogue will be essential. Skipping over, because I repeated that one. Remove barriers. So you're building bridges. You're forming relationship and friendship. You're asking questions. Remove barriers. We almost all agree that some barriers, some boundaries, are necessary when it comes to sex relations. What and how do we determine the appropriate sexual boundaries? You know, I mean, this is one of the things where even at its root, where some people want to say that you should be able to do whatever you want to do sexually, and everybody kind of ultimately says, or most everybody, well, there's got to be some limits. Shouldn't be forced. We should protect kids. But then it becomes, but they have no rational basis for any of those moral positions. They're just, there's no morality there. This is the part where we sit there and we say, we believe that Jesus gives us the best way of living in the world and the best way of living as a sexual being. The teaching of Jesus on sexual boundaries leads to true human flourishing. While there are problems out there, we all are broken. Phil, here's your point. And this becomes one of those things. Now notice the way I did it is it's last, right? I mean, at some point we want to sit there. And now if we get to know the people, we'll probably know their brokenness. Because everybody's broken. And so it can even be a more effective way of reaching out to them. While Christians can sometimes confuse the message of Jesus to moralizing and judgmentalism, the true message of the cross is God's great love for all people, who all of us need his help. With sex in its proper place, we are set free to really love. And love there, this is the part going back to that initial observation. Our society is just kind of sexually wacko. We've made sex this huge, big thing. And it's, the actual act of making love. And it's great. It's good. It's got its place. But I think off the top of my head, I could quickly give you 10 things more important in your life than making love will be. And at the center of it is going to be actually loving people in the way the Bible describes love. Love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love always hopes. Love never fails when you're doing it the way that God wants. And this becomes the part where, again, of winning the right with people. We want to be friends. We want to love them. We will stand by them. We had a transgender person who worshiped with us for a time. Person called me at 1 o'clock in the morning, can you come pick me up at the hospital? Of course. That's what you do, because you care. And it doesn't matter if I'm concerned for the decisions you're making about what you're doing with your own body as far as sexual reassignment surgeries and all those things. I'm going to be a friend to you, and I'm going to try to help you the best that I can. With that person, they knew that I cared for them. That's the way that it should be for anybody that we're in relationship with. And what they do as sexual beings, you and I, they're not following Jesus yet. We don't expect them to understand our mores, to do it our way. They're far from that. The whole culture is getting in the way of that. So we have to do it in such a way that what they experience most of all is friendship and love. And at some point, friendship will not remain silent. Friendship will ask questions. Friendship will challenge. But you got to have the strength of the relationship. What time is it?
7:40. 7:40.
Have a good night, everybody. Lord, thank you for tonight and the opportunity to talk about these things. Pray your blessings over us in Jesus' name. Amen.